Welcome to another episode of Suturing Time. And today we were going to talk about the historical context of Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. And I think I'll turn it over to Phil as our resident military historian here. So where did you want to go with this today, Phil?
Well, what I'm going to try to do is relate a lifetime of study to the development of some very disturbing contemporary events. And as I was thinking, also as I was doing this, I remember that last Monday night, March 7th, I helped a high school student with her world history homework, and she was studying. They called it the Road to World War One. And mostly she did her own homework, and I sort of helped interpret the questions because they came out of like a computer generated box or something like that. And as I was thinking about that, I was thinking, considering how important this history is, and considering that we're on the edge of an abyss, that we have an obligation to remember history so we don't make the same mistakes again and again and again. And as I was sitting here thinking, well, how am I going to talk for 45 minutes about this and say anything? And how can I keep from just running off in a direction? I was looking for a thread. So I'm going to talk about some men, and I'm going to talk about a different world of information. There was a time before the internet. We probably have to go back, 30 years or so. But before the internet, there were news magazines, and they were really a big deal because that's how we shaped the world. And one of these magazines, Time, had a special feature. Well, I'm not going to say exactly what the feature was right away, but I'm going to mention the name Adolf Hitler, Vladimir Putin, Winston Churchill, Joseph Stalin, and Theodore Roosevelt. Now, these are all men who have shaped my life, and they were powerful men in their own right. But at the end of each year, Time magazine would pick their man of the year. Of course, now it's person of the year because we know that we speak differently about history now, and we sort of retrospectively make it politically correct. But Hitler was Time magazine Man of the Year for 1938. And he was made Man of the Year because it was thought at that time he had agreed to what they called peace in our time. In 1938, the world was terrified by the idea of another world war. They remembered the suffering. There were still people alive under even your age who had fought and watched their friends and watched a whole generation die in the First World War. The First World War was important because modern industrial technology was able to turn factories and nations into killing machines that manufactured death, which only sought more death. One of the things that the people of Europe were most afraid of was attack by the air and poison gas. Anyway, Hitler became Man of the Year, and yet was it 7 years later, April 30th of 1945, in a bunker with a Russian army within a few yards from capturing him. He shoved his German Luger into his mouth and blew his brains out. Stalin was made Man of the Year the next year. And some of you, I hope there's still somebody left in a history course someplace that's teaching identifications so that you know that Winston Churchill was the British aristocrat who went up against Stalin, or not Stalin, up against Hitler, and held out against one of the most horrific series of bombings to that time in the history of humanity. Stalin succeeding Hitler as Man of the Year was fascinating. I'll go back and say that, as I said, Churchill was a graduate of what they call the British public school system, and he served as he was educated in the British equivalent of West Point, and he went on to a distinguished career, became the British Secretary of what they didn't call it Secretary of the Navy, but the First Lord of the Admiralty, and he was fired from that job because of the particular mistakes he had made. But now you compare, and Roosevelt, born in 1882, was also an American aristocrat, born in New York, part of New York State, and part of the colonial Dutch aristocracy that settled that area, bought New York from the Indians, and that's where he grew up, studied, and went to Harvard. So all these men's lives are sort of patched together. And the year after Hitler was made Man of the Year, Stalin was made Man of the Year, and after Munich, which was thought to be peace in our time, this is what they hoped for. This was the magazine editors' hope for. They made Stalin, who was a co-signatory to the non-aggression pact that allowed Germany to invade Poland, followed 2 weeks later by a Russian invasion of eastern Poland. So these two men betrayed each other, and the events broke out in such a way that the thing that the Europeans feared the most became the nightmare dream, became their political reality. Why don't Eastern Europeans like Russians? Why are Eastern Europeans afraid of Russian? Well, Poland has a historical nationalistic identity. We've talked a little bit about it. For example, in 1688, Poland was one of the most powerful countries in the world and actually saved Vienna, Austria, from being conquered by the Turks. When we study Europe now, we think of it as the leading part of the world. European civilization is, I have a little coffee here to help me out, the apex of the world. But it wasn't always like that. Napoleon said of Europe, it's like a little appendix that hangs out over the Eurasian landmass. And Napoleon had no better luck at conquering Russia. What am I trying to say? I'm trying to say that peace is very expensive. When I started on this study, I was an isolationist. I thought we could just say, well, let those Europeans solve their own problems. We're going to stay behind our fence in America. But what I started to think and transform all this coursework, all these classes I had studied, is to say, you really can't appease a dictator. You really can't just assume that they're misunderstood and they're going to be nice guys. So what strategy do we have? Well, we're all invested with something like 10,000 nuclear weapons in the world and not having the world end. So that becomes sort of our goal. I sat down with some of my academic friends, one of them particularly Dr. Kemp, who I respect a lot. And he suggests that Putin is not part of the new world order, but he's the last gasp of the old world order. I mean, we're now coming to the point where it looks like sanctions are going into effect, and it looks like they're really hurting the Russian people, the Russian government, and anybody that may have their their life savings or their retirement or their annuity in rubles is getting out of it. I mean, you made the point with as far as the oligarchs being able to pick up assets at rock bottom prices because everyone's divesting. And if Russia is ever restored, they're going to owe even more of the pie, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
What we didn't expect, and nobody suspected it, was the absolute courage of the Ukrainian people and the ineptness of the Russian military. Putin expected to be in Kiev within a few days, but the Ukrainians fought back. I often it's interesting to compare that to Afghanistan, where nobody would fight for us. We couldn't build an army. We couldn't build a Vietnamese army. We've never been able to build an army. But on the other hand, we can support a nationalist movement and they become our army, if I'm clear. You know, it's like I'm digressing a little bit, but I'm thinking about the way in my generation, people who supported the Vietnam War expected that if Vietnam fell, that there was a domino effect. One country after another, after another would fall after it. And so China and Vietnam had a bit of a dust up in the late 1970s, and China found themselves in their own Vietnam War with the side they had supported. There's a World War II columnist. His name is Bill Malden, I believe, and it shows a cartoon of a huge kind of grotesque Chinese guy, and it says Vietnamese Chinese friendship bridge, and you see the Chinese guy with a big stub toe. The friendship bridge didn't work out so well. So I'm not sure exactly where it goes from here. The last thing that really, I mean, it's almost like Putin has a public relations department that makes him look bad in front of the world. You know, that's one thing about electronic media. I mean, the cameras come out and we can see the devastation.
Mm-hmm.
So there was another to me a development that made me feel good. Poland and Russia had exchanged military hardware, and Poland had bought a number of MiG-29s, which is a pretty big deal. I don't think it's a top of the line Russian line fighter, but it's a pretty big deal. And Poland was going to lend them to the Ukraine. Now, we're all glad it didn't happen, because if Russia gets pissed off enough, I guess I said that, then they are willing to take the kind of these Putin scenes. Again, you have to separate Putin from Russia. But the Russian people were willing to take immense casualties to defend Russia. So what I guess there's a story. I'll try to tell it. I guess I guess Putin's background as a young man was definitely not upper class, and he lived in a rat infested complex with his mother, I guess it was. And as the story goes, one of his hobbies, he told us to Mitron, was to chase rats. He liked to chase rats. But if you catch a rat, then it'll bite you. And I think that that might be the thing to say for us, for the rest of the world. Again, let them work it out. Do what we can. The sanctions are working almost like a military blockade, and as they keep working, there there will be wives of oligarchs that are going to want their Western goodies. They're going to want the symbols of conspicuous for consumption and kleptography that their husbands had worked so hard to achieve. Now, if that money isn't good, what good are the husbands? I know I'm trying to lighten this up a little bit, but it's almost. I feel almost. I never expected the level of courage and the casualties that the Russians are taking in this process, and it turns out that they're not sending Russian conscripts in because they would think they were going to the beach in Sevastopol or something, not that they'd be part of a military attack. So, what happens for the future? Well, I don't know. I would draw from George, is it H. Bush, the older one, or is that George W. Bush?
HW, yeah.
Yeah, H.W. Well, although I supported, I did not support Gulf War One. Although looking back, I think I said this last time we talked. Saddam Hussein was a really bad guy and was willing to use some terrifying weapons. But George Bush Sr. did say after the 100-day Gulf War, 100-hour Gulf War One, let the killing stop. And I that would be the best outcome possible to me if the killing would stop. Is that going to happen? Well, I guess we'll have to tune in next week, and maybe I should produce a little more structured show format. Except this is history, almost all of which I've lived through. I mean, when I was growing up, what we did in World War II made us a guiding, shining light of the world, and we attempted to treat those as who are enemies as if they were our brothers. We rebuilt Europe. We did a lot of very positive things that don't get into the history classes. I took a history of the Nazi movement from UW Eau Claire, and my professor, who I like very much, was very adamant about recruiting for Amnesty International. And I like Amnesty International. I think they do important work because they bring dictators into the light of day. We talked about that, coming out and out from under the rock into the light of day. But at the same time, there was not a single word about the Marshall Plan. And the Marshall Plan was the American investment that rebuilt a devastated Europe after World War II. Because at least we had learned that if you don't treat your enemy in a humane way, they will rise up against you, wrathful. And if they have any kind of technology or even lack of a technology and commitment, you got a really serious problem. So to me, I think that peace is a much better thing. I mean, oh, I wouldn't want to be conscripted. I took one look at the Vietnam War and said, given what I know about World War One and what I studied, it ain't for me. Do you have any questions, Brock?
No, I mean, if you want to keep going, just go ahead.
Well, actually, I
Couple
will.
things for the end, but I don't want to get you off track. So
Okay. Well, another thing I do is I've been gifted with a retirement and a long life and improving physical health and privilege. And that privilege has reawakened in me a sense of responsibility. And maybe it's to that 17-year-old girl that's having a little trouble with her history and wants to graduate high school. But it's made me sort of come back in the game. And when I listen to some of these experts, and when I was 22 years old, Dick Cheney was at UW-Madison. And if I worked hard enough, I'm sure that there would be a political theory course that I sat next to him. Probably stole his lunch because we were students, you know. But I mean, it brings me back. And the latest take with the establishment is to say something like, if you want to study, what can you say about the guy wrote a 2,000 page biography of Stalin? And it's a pretty good book in a way, but it's not a good book because he says all I can say about the Russians was that they were communists. And I thought, how can I address this monumental work of scholarship that says the communists, that Stalin and Khrushchev and the crew were all communists. And I thought, well, I guess I can, because what I love to do is steal somebody's concept. And I would say, what you can say about those communists was they were opportunistic and they were Russians first. One of the things communism is alleged to be atheistic. It's alleged to be godless. It's alleged to be horrific. It's not so simple because those communists were Russian too, and they were our allies, and they did 80% of the fighting on the Western Front, or on the Eastern Front. I'm sorry. And I think I look at this Time magazine, and I'm thinking, one year the guy is the man of the year. The next year he signs a treaty with Stalin, and the year after that they're at war. Well, I would like to know where this comes from, but what I mean where this comes from is how somebody can rise up from something so low, you know, being a middle range or lower range KGB agent to being a premier or a crazy street person who can't get into art school becomes chancellor of one of the most powerful countries in the world. And Winston Churchill had his hard knocks too, being discredited for his role in the Admiralty. And here you have Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a cripple, you know, and it's only recently it's brought out. I'm sometimes in need of a wheelchair, but when I think of it, I'm so much more mobile than the president of the United States. People, there's some agency there. There's some agency in humanity that can lift these. It's like a machine almost that lifts these people up, and maybe could lift some of us up too, give us some purpose, and say, well, what do you have to lose? Maybe it is a world that doesn't give a rat, and you can think of the last part of it because I'm not going to use that. Mm-hmm. But I think of the Russian grandma, the Ukrainian grandmother letting the Russian soldier use their cell phone to call home. These people don't deserve to be out in the world killing each other. I saw something else that's hopeful to me. Uh, President of China is now saying we will not allow America to form a Pacific NATO. And I was thinking, well, maybe it would be a pretty good idea after we see what a purposeful nationalistic aggressor can do if empowered. So maybe I'm reluctantly, as we talk in the show, I'm I'm stumbling back into being an internationalist.
Mm.
Well, I think I'm pretty much covered for today, and I love this format.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting, Phil. I think that's well put together. Um,
Well, I have the support of Kathy over here, not to mention my wife, and technologies. I'm gonna tell you the kind. I'm gonna say something more. America. There's a line from Joan Baez. Uh, Show me a country that bombs haven't touched. Well, bombs have touched America with 9/11, but what a horrible place Europe can be, and the horrific nature that way that Europeans have historically treated each other is is hard to conceive. Okay, I'm going to talk. I said there was a non-aggression pact between Stalin and Hitler, which allowed Hitler to invade Western and annex Western Poland, and Stalin Hitler would own Western Poland, and Stalin would invade and occupy Eastern Poland. Now, when the German army swept through a place called the Khatan Forest, they found fresh graves, and those fresh graves were 15,000 Polish officers that had been captured by the Russians as they retreated, and they were all executed. And when I took history originally, it wasn't clear if it had been the Germans or the Russians that did it, because both had reasons for not wanting those Polish officers to lead a Polish insurrection. But by the time I came back into history, Gorbachev had taken full responsibility for the Russian army executing those 15,000 Poles. Now I got to fact check this a little bit, and anything I say is sort of coming from memory. But there's a way that historical truth can work its way out, and things that you think would be horrific, like paying $2 more for gasoline, are nothing compared to what most people have to feel in the world. So I guess a friend of mine, Matt Filio, if I can figure a way to link one of his graphics, I'd like to do it. He's a representative artist, profoundly Christian, very, very, very good at technical aspects of representation. And he has a painting called The Somme Cafe. And the setting is the World War One battlefield of the Somme. And I've talked about that a little bit, as a battle in which more British were killed in 3 days than Americans were killed in all of Vietnam. But you see these two highborn ladies inside of a bubble having their tea and crumpets with a battle raging around them, almost as if they're looking in from another dimension. And you can bet after we finish this video, I'm going to get on the phone with my friend Matt Filio, has done a pretty good portrait of me. And we'll talk a little bit more, and we'll see if maybe I can show you what I mean by America being inside the Somme Cafe. You know, reality and history breaks through. I mean, if nothing else, we learned that with COVID. I mean, I'm not sure what the American deaths total, but it's close to the number of total Americans killed in all our wars, and at least as many as in the Civil War and World War II combined. So we sit sort of looking out the window, waiting for the brick to come through. Now, is there anything inspirational in that? Well, yeah, I guess so. If I would have an army, Brock, they would be cynics. They're not going to. They're going to start out disillusioned to say, "Well, no, we just aren't going to do that." And the idea of the 40-mile long traffic jam outside of Kiev just toots my horn. And what's so funny is a very similar thing happened in 1939, 1940, when Russia invaded Finland. And they got some Finnish territory, but they really got their noses broken. Just amazing. And in the end, Stalin recognized the courage of the Finns because they were the only one the only one of the Eastern European powers that cooperated or collaborated or was at a war with Russia that got their own treaty. And the treaty between the Russians and the Finns is never again. You're not going to let anybody in, and we're not going to attack you. And sometimes, treaties may be a lousy substitute, but I think they're the best that we got. And they're certainly better than, like I think Churchill said, jaws, talk, is better than war. I also want to make a memory or make a notation to a fairly recent history teacher I took, Dr. Paul Lazda, who I admire a great deal, who actually experienced World War II as a 6 or 7-year-old refugee, and his family was on the hit list for both the Nazis and the Russians. And I said, well, which were you the most afraid of? And he said, oh, the Nazis by far. They were most efficient. The Russians always got it wrong with the bureaucratic stuff. And I guess as I talk about my interventionist point of view, I want to give credit to another guy from UW-Madison, Dick Walker. He was a science librarian and very interested in science. He had the old liberal, by liberal, I don't mean politically correct liberal, but open-minded, free speech, scientific-oriented, give me proof point of view. And Dick Walker was absolutely sure that the Nazis were very, very close from having a nuclear warhead, and nuclear warheads on those 100,000 or 10,000 V2s would have made a difference. So how about closing for that? That didn't happen.